This story is titled, Mother-in-Law Secretly Sold Our Wedding Gifts to Fund Her Daughter's Dream Wedding. Now she's homeless after her daughter abandoned her at a nursing home. I never thought I'd witness someone's life completely shatter because of their own choices, let alone watch it happen to my mother-in-law. The same woman who once paraded around in designer clothes and bragged about her country club membership now sits alone in a budget nursing home, abandoned by the very daughter she sacrificed everything for, including my happiness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, back when I thought I was living a fairy tale. I'm Jessica, 28 and 5 years ago. I married the love of my life, Mark, 30. We were the typical middle-class couple with big dreams but modest means. Mark worked as a high school teacher, while I had just started my career as a nurse. What we lacked in wealth, we made up for in love and support from our friends and family, or so I thought. Enter Margaret, 55, my mother-in-law, a widow who lived off her late husband's insurance money and spent most of her time maintaining her image in our small Connecticut town. She had 2 children, my husband, Mark, and his younger sister, Sophia, 26. From the moment I met Margaret, I could tell she had different standards for her 2 children. Mark was the reliable one who could do no wrong, but Sophia was her precious princess who deserved the world. When Mark proposed, I was over the moon. We planned a modest but beautiful wedding within our budget. Everything was perfect, until Margaret started pushing for a double wedding. You see, Sophia had just gotten engaged to Daniel, 27, a successful real estate agent, and Margaret insisted it would be more economical to combine the celebrations. We refused, wanting our own special day. Margaret seemed to accept our decision, even offering to help with the wedding planning. She was surprisingly supportive, volunteering to manage our gift registry and coordinate with the vendors. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags when she insisted on having all the wedding gifts delivered to her house to keep them safe. The wedding was beautiful, everything we dreamed of. Our guests were incredibly generous, and according to the registry list, we'd received enough gifts to furnish our entire new home. But when we returned from our honeymoon, ready to start our life together, we had no idea that our perfect beginning was about to unravel in the most heartbreaking way. What happened next would not only test our marriage, but reveal a betrayal so deep that it would tear our entire family apart. The first sign that something was wrong came when we visited Margaret's house to collect our wedding gifts. The spacious living room, where she promised to store everything, was eerily empty except for a few small boxes in the corner. My stomach dropped as Margaret nervously explained that most guests had opted to give us gift cards instead of physical presents. But that didn't align with the countless thank you cards I'd written based on the registry list she'd given me. I spent the night cross-referencing our registry with the actual gifts we received. The numbers didn't add up, not even close. The expensive stand mixer from my aunt? Nowhere to be found. The complete set of La Cruza cookware from Mark's colleagues? Missing! The handmade quilt from my grandmother that had taken her months to complete? Gone! When I showed Mark the discrepancies, he was initially skeptical. After all, what mother would steal from her own son? But as we dug deeper, we discovered something that made my blood run cold. Sophia's wedding planning was in full swing, and her registry was filled with items surprisingly similar to what our guests had gifted us. The next few weeks were a blur of fake smiles and building tension. Mark and I attended Sophia's engagement party, where I noticed her kitchen was stocked with items identical to those missing from our registry. My heart nearly stopped when I spotted my grandmother's quilt draped over Sophia's couch. She claimed it was a vintage find from an antique store. I wanted to confront them right there, but Mark urged patience. We needed proof. We started quietly reaching out to our wedding guests, asking about their gifts under the pretense of writing personalized thank you notes. The responses confirmed our worst fears. Our guests had been incredibly generous, but their gifts had never made it to us. What hurt the most wasn't just the monetary value of the missing items. It was the realization that Margaret had systematically sold or redistributed our wedding gifts to fund Sophia's upcoming dream wedding. Each discovery felt like a fresh betrayal. The stand mixer we'd lost? It had been sold on Facebook Marketplace. The cookware set? Redistributed to Sophia's registry. But the true magnitude of Margaret's betrayal was still hidden from us. As we would soon discover, the missing wedding gifts were just the tip of the iceberg. A chance encounter at a local cafe would reveal something far more sinister about Margaret's plans for both weddings, and Sophia's role in all of this was about to become crystal clear. Little did we know, confronting Margaret about the gifts would set off a chain of events that would expose decades of family secrets and eventually lead to her own undoing. That chance encounter I mentioned? It happened on a rainy Tuesday at my favorite coffee shop. I was nursing my third cup when I overheard someone mention Margaret's name. Looking up, I recognized Linda, 58, the wedding planner who had handled our ceremony. She was sitting with another client, unaware of my presence, discussing how Margaret had tried to cancel our venue payment after our wedding to redirect the funds to Sophia's upcoming celebration. My hand shook as I processed this information. The venue had been paid for by my parents. How could Margaret have tried to access those funds? I stayed there, frozen, as Linda continued talking about how Margaret had attempted the same thing with several other vendors, claiming she was the mother of the bride and had authority to make changes. When I got home that evening, I found Mark surrounded by old family photos and financial documents. His face was ashen. He'd spent the day going through his late father's papers after discovering some discrepancies in his own bank account. What he found was staggering. Margaret had been systematically draining an education fund his father had set up for him since he was 18, transferring small amounts to Sophia's accounts over the years. The fund should have contained over $50,000. It now held barely $3,000. But the real shock came when we discovered why Margaret was so desperate for money. Sophia's dream wedding wasn't just about having nice things. She had demanded a destination wedding in the Maldives for 200 guests. The estimated cost? Nearly $200,000. And Daniel, her supposedly successful fiancé, wasn't contributing a dime. In fact, we discovered he had recently lost his real estate license due to ethical violations and had been unemployed for months. The pieces were falling into place. Margaret had been living off her late husband's insurance money, but it wasn't enough to fund Sophia's extravagant demands, so she'd resorted to stealing from Mark, selling our wedding gifts, and attempting to defraud our vendors. What made it worse was finding Sophia's text messages on Margaret's phone when she asked us to help her with her computer one day. They had planned this together, laughing about how basic our wedding had been and how they deserved to have something truly spectacular. I wanted to scream. 5 years of gifts from our loving friends and family sold off to the highest bidders. Mark's education fund drained year after year, all to satisfy Sophia's obsession with having the perfect wedding. But we still hadn't confronted them. We were gathering evidence, building our case. We had no idea that Margaret's carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse in the most unexpected way. What happened next would not only expose the full extent of their betrayal, but would also reveal an even darker secret about Sophia's relationship with Daniel, one that would ultimately lead to Margaret's downfall. The confrontation happened 3 weeks before Sophia's wedding, during what was supposed to be a normal Sunday dinner at Margaret's house. My stomach was in knots as we arrived, carrying a folder full of evidence, bank statements, screenshots, witness accounts from our wedding guests, and statements from the vendors. Mark was unusually quiet, the weight of his mother's betrayal visible in the lines of his face. What we didn't expect was to walk into another crisis already in progress. We found Margaret in tears on her couch, clutching her phone, while Sophia raged about the wedding venue cancellation. Apparently, the resort in the Maldives had dropped their booking after Daniel's credit card was declined for the final payment. Sophia was demanding that Margaret sell her house to fund the wedding, the same house that Mark's father had worked his entire life to pay off. I'll never forget the look on Margaret's face when Mark calmly placed our folder of evidence on her coffee table. As he methodically laid out every betrayal, every theft, every lie, Margaret's perfectly maintained facade began to crack. She tried to justify everything. The sold gifts were just temporary loans. The drained education fund was for family emergencies. The attempted venue fraud was a misunderstanding. But Sophia's reaction was what truly shocked us. Instead of showing remorse or shame, she turned on Margaret with savage fury. In her anger, she revealed something none of us knew. She and Daniel had already been secretly married for 6 months in a courthouse ceremony. This extravagant wedding was just for show away to get expensive gifts and have a luxury honeymoon. She had convinced Margaret to fund it by threatening to cut her off from any future grandchildren. Margaret crumpled under this revelation. The daughter she'd sacrificed everything for her relationship with her son, her integrity, her financial security had been manipulating her all along. The sight of my mother-in-law, usually so proud and put together, sobbing uncontrollably on her sofa, should have brought me satisfaction. Instead, I felt a complex mix of pity and anger. Mark, however, wasn't finished. He pulled out one final document, a police report he'd filed documenting the theft of our wedding gifts and the fraud attempted with our vendors. He wasn't pressing charges yet, but he wanted Margaret to understand the gravity of her actions. The choice was simple. She could either sign a confession and agree to repayment terms, or we would pursue legal action. As Margaret reached for the confession with trembling hands, Sophia made a phone call that would set in motion the final, devastating chapter of this family saga. None of us could have predicted how her next actions would not only destroy her mother's life, but also reveal the disturbing truth about her marriage to Daniel. The following week would bring revelations that would make our stolen wedding gifts seem trivial in comparison and force us all to confront the true cost of enabling toxic family dynamics. The week after the confrontation changed everything. Sophia's phone call had been to Daniel, but instead of coming to support his wife, he finally confessed the truth. He'd lost his job 3 months ago due to repeatedly missing deals and poor performance reviews. Instead of telling Sophia, he'd been using their savings to maintain their lifestyle, hoping to land a new position before anyone noticed. The money was gone. The $180,000 so of Margaret's savings that she'd transferred to help with the wedding had been steadily draining away for months spent on luxury car payments, expensive dinners, and a facade of success that Daniel and Sophia had desperately tried to maintain. Sophia hadn't just been planning a wedding. She'd been living a lifestyle they couldn't afford, obsessed with creating the perfect Instagram life she felt she deserved. Margaret's world imploded. Her perfect daughter, the one she'd sacrificed everything for, had been living in a bubble of denial and materialism. Sophia's response to losing everything was what truly broke Margaret. Instead of accepting responsibility, Sophia blamed everyone else. Daniel for losing his job, her mother for not giving her more money, even her brother for having a basic wedding that made her feel like she needed something grander. She packed her bags and moved in with a college friend in Florida, blocking her mother's number and all social media contact. Her last words to her mother were a text message that read, "You never understood how important this was to me. I'll never forgive you for letting my dreams fall apart." The confession Mark had made, Margaret's sign now seemed almost merciful compared to what followed. With her savings gone and her daughter's betrayal crushing her spirit, Margaret couldn't keep up with her mortgage payments. The house she'd lived in for 30 years, where she'd raised her children, went into foreclosure. She tried selling her designer clothes and jewelry to save it, but the debt was too deep. I watched my mother-in-law's transformation with a mix of vindication and pity. The woman who once judged my Target furniture now slept on a second-hand mattress in a tiny rental apartment. Her country club friends, the same ones she bragged to about Sophia's spectacular destination wedding, now avoided her calls. Her carefully maintained image of the perfect mother and socialite had shattered completely. Mark struggled with his own emotions during this time. His mother had betrayed him, stolen from him, and favored his sister. Yet seeing her broken brought him no joy. We offered to help her find financial counseling, but her pride was still too strong to accept help from the son she'd stolen from. Instead, she retreated further into isolation, her only companion the bottle of wine that seemed to never empty. Then came the incident that would force all of us to make impossible decisions. One night, Margaret, drunk and disoriented, caused a minor car accident in the grocery store parking lot. No one was hurt, but the responding officers found her living in her car. She'd been evicted from her apartment 2 weeks earlier and hadn't told anyone. She was at rock bottom. But what happened next would test our capacity for forgiveness in ways we never expected. As we stood in the hospital waiting room that night, none of us could have predicted how this rock bottom would lead to an unexpected reconciliation and force us all to confront the true meaning of family. The hospital gave us 2 options for Margaret. We could either take responsibility for her care or let the state place her in a facility. Despite everything she'd done, Mark couldn't bear the thought of his mother becoming a ward of the state. After hours of discussion, we found a modest but well-maintained nursing home that would accept Margaret on a sliding scale payment system. It wasn't the luxury retirement community she'd always bragged about joining someday, but it was clean, safe, and, most importantly, it would help her get sober. Margaret's admission to Golden Oaks Nursing Home was a subdued affair. As we helped her settle into her small shared room, I couldn't help but notice how her designer suitcase, the only remnant of her previous life, looked absurdly out of place next to the standard issue furniture. Her roommate, a kind elderly woman named Edith, tried to make conversation, but Margaret just stared out the window, clutching her phone, still hoping for a message from Sophia that would never come. The first month was the hardest. Margaret went through alcohol withdrawal, and without her usual coping mechanisms of shopping and social status, she was forced to confront the reality of her choices. The nursing home's counselor worked with her daily, but her pride still prevented her from fully engaging in group therapy. She'd sit in the common room, apart from the other residents, still trying to maintain the facade of being different from them. Everything changed when Edith, her roommate, shared her own story one quiet evening. She had also lost everything once, not to theft or scams, but to her own pride and materialism. She'd spent her children's college funds trying to keep up with wealthy neighbors, ultimately losing both her money and her relationship with her kids. But over years of hard work and genuine change, she'd rebuilt those relationships. Her story sparked something in Margaret. Gradually, Margaret stopped wearing makeup, abandoned her designer clothes for the nursing home's provided attire, and finally began participating in therapy. Mark visited her weekly, and I started joining him after she made her first genuine apology, not a manipulative one, but a broken, honest acknowledgement of how she'd hurt us. Then, 6 months into her stay at Golden Oaks, something unexpected arrived in the mail, a letter from Sophia. She'd hit her own rock bottom in Florida. The friend she'd been staying with had kicked her out after Sophia tried to take over her life with the same controlling behavior she'd learned from Margaret. Living in a cheap motel and working as a waitress, Sophia had finally begun to understand the damage her materialistic obsession had caused. Along with Sophia's letter was a familiar package, my grandmother's quilt, which she'd retrieved from the person she'd sold it to. Sophia had spent 3 months' worth of tips to buy it back. The sight of Margaret holding that quilt, running her fingers over the stitches she'd once dismissed as too homemade-looking, became a turning point in her recovery. The real breakthrough came during a therapy session, when Margaret finally admitted that her obsession with status and appearances had stemmed from her own mother's constant criticism. She had spent her life trying to prove her worth through material success, then projected those same impossible standards onto her children. Understanding this generational pattern of toxic perfectionism helped her begin to break it. Today, Edith and Margaret have become unlikely best friends, sharing morning coffee and helping new residents adjust to life at Golden Oaks. Their room has become known as the Wisdom Corner, where other residents come for advice and support. The designer suitcase has been donated, replaced by simple, practical items that better reflect Margaret's new values. Sophia has started visiting monthly, their relationship slowly healing as both mother and daughter learn to value authenticity over appearances. Daniel is no longer in the picture. He moved back in with his parents in Ohio, still unemployed, but no longer pretending to be something he's not. As I watch Margaret interact with other residents, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the price of materialism and the value of genuine connections, I realize that sometimes losing everything isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a better one. Margaret may have lost her house, her status, and, temporarily, her family, but she gained something more valuable: the ability to live authentically and love unconditionally. The quilt now decorates her bed at Golden Oaks, a daily reminder that the most precious things in life aren't the ones with the highest price tags, but the ones made with love and strengthened by forgiveness. A year has passed since Margaret first entered Golden Oaks, and the transformation in our family dynamics has been remarkable. Last weekend, we celebrated Mark's birthday in the nursing home's community room, something that would have mortified the old Margaret. Instead, she proudly helped Edith arrange simple decorations and baked cookies using her mother's recipe, a family tradition she'd abandoned years ago in favor of expensive catered desserts. Sophia now lives in a small apartment near us, working 2 jobs, still waitressing and recently starting as a social media manager for a local boutique. The irony isn't lost on any of us that she's now helping other businesses maintain their image, but with a hard-earned understanding of authenticity's value over perfection. She's slowly paying back some of the money spent on the failed wedding, not because we demanded it, but because she wants to make amends. During one of her recent visits, Sophia brought a box of old family photos she'd kept after moving to Florida. As we sorted through them together in Margaret's room, we found pictures from my wedding day that we thought were lost forever. There was one particular photo of Margaret adjusting my veil, a genuine moment of connection we'd shared before everything fell apart. Margaret held that photo for a long time, finally admitting that even then, she'd been more concerned about how the photos would look on social media than the actual meaning of the moment. The most significant change came last month when Margaret was offered a private room at Golden Oaks. To everyone's surprise, she declined, choosing to remain with Edith. "I spent too many years of my life choosing appearances over connections," she explained. "Edith's friendship means more to me than having a bigger room to myself. Mark and I are expecting our first child now, and Margaret's reaction to the news showed how much she's grown. Instead of immediately planning an elaborate baby shower or asking about designer nursery furniture, she simply held my hand and promised to be the kind of grandmother who values presence over presents. She's even started knitting a baby blanket, something the old Margaret would have considered beneath her social status." Sophia's journey has been equally transformative. She recently started dating again, but this time with a different perspective. Her new boyfriend is a high school teacher who drives a 10-year-old car and lives in a modest apartment. The old Sophia would have dismissed him immediately, but now she talks about how his passion for teaching and genuine kindness make her feel truly valued. Last week, my grandmother finally agreed to visit Margaret at Golden Oaks. I held my breath as these 2 women, one who had created a beautiful quilt as a gift of love, and one who had once sold it without a second thought, sat down for tea. To my amazement, they spent hours together, with Margaret listening intently as my grandmother shared stories about her own mother's handmade quilts and the traditions behind them. The quilt still holds a place of honor on Margaret's bed, but now it's joined by other handmade items: a crocheted throw from Edith, Sophia's first attempt at knitting a rather lopsided scarf, and the beginning of the baby blanket for our child. Each item tells a story not of monetary value, but of love, learning, and redemption. Today, Margaret leads a weekly group at Golden Oaks called Real Talk, where residents share their stories of loss, regret, and renewal. She often starts by showing new members 2 photos, one of her standing alone in designer clothes at her country club, and another of all of us together at Mark's recent birthday celebration. The first photo shows everything I thought I wanted, she tells them. The second shows everything I nearly lost before I learned what really matters. As I watch her now, helping another resident learn to knit while Edith teases her about her crooked stitches, I realize that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as losses. Margaret lost her house, her status, and her carefully curated image. But in their place, she found authenticity, genuine relationships, and the ability to finally be herself. The story of our wedding gifts and their theft will always be part of our family history, but it's no longer the story that defines us. Instead, we're writing a new chapter 1, where the most valuable gifts aren't found in registries or wrapped in expensive paper, but in the genuine moments we share and the love we choose to give freely, without expectation or condition.